Hi everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to draw cat paws in Graphite. Now the first thing here that I wanted to do is work on the cat that was sleeping in the background, and that was out of focus. So in order to create that very soft effect, I'm using graphite powder and applying that with an eye makeup applicator. Now I will at times come back in with my pencils, but predominantly the base layer here and building up that main softness has all been done with the graphite powder. Now I wasn't looking to get a lot of detail here, which is why the pencils are not necessary for building up details. If you want to create something that's very out of focus, then try as much as you can to stick with the graphite powder. Obviously the more out of focus an element is further in the distance, you may not need to use your pencils at all. Now smaller studies like this are great to work on if you want to break up that routine, especially if you're starting to feel a little bit burnt out. Now that feeling of not wanting to create can be very difficult to overcome, but one of the things that can really help is in between your larger full projects, work on some smaller studies like this, because it really does help to keep the length of time that we're working on different projects varied, and I do find that that can really help keep us motivated. Now this also allows us to use a specific set of techniques. So this little study, it's really going to be great for refining the practice when working with a Tombow mono eraser, for example, how we've still got to focus on building up the layers and contrast, but also with that background portion where I've had to work with those out of focus and blending techniques. But I've not had to work on a large scale. This is a 4" by 8" size project, so it means that I could have got this done in a few hours. It's something that I can then break up that routine and fit in something like this in between my more demanding projects. Now onto the paws, and this is where I really wanted to break it up into much smaller sections, one toe at a time if needed. The reason being, I think it's very easy to start to work on too many larger areas, block it in one layer at a time, and then we lose which toe we're working on. Now when that happens, the toes can start to take on a different shape and size, which would obviously then start to affect the proportions and perspective of that area. So you don't want the toes and the feet to start looking at a different angle. You're going to then change the complete shape of that animal's leg and foot. So it is something to pay very close attention to. So for me personally, to make sure that I avoid that, I like to break it up into very small sections, 1 square inch or 1 centimetre at a time if needed. Now as I start to build up my layers here, you can see that I'm working with a couple of different erasing techniques and tools, and I'm really focusing on the layers and contrast. As I start to build up a good base layer where I'm using a combination of my graphite pencils, I'm working with my subtle layers. So here I'm looking at just shading in more of a solid layer, but I am hinting at the main lights and darks. But my biggest tip here is we don't want to be jumping into our darkest pencil for the first layer. Even though some sections of the fur here are very dark, they've got strong shadows in many areas, I'm not going to jump into my darkest pencil for the first layer. Now the reason being, I do just feel it enhances the depth. You can see a lot of those very subtle midtones that are showing through. They look a little bit lighter than the layers of darker values that were added on top. Now one thing that is obvious, although I was using the pencils and following the fur direction, it's only when I start to build in the highlights here with my erasing tools that the fur direction is influenced more so. And this is just because the fur is so dark, the highlights there are standing out even more. So if I was to work with my highlights and they weren't as bright as they should be, that might be an indication that the layers underneath are not dark enough. Now usually, as long as the graphite is applied in the right way, the erasers should be able to lift up majority of that graphite. You've seen here that those highlights are very bright and yet the base layers underneath were pretty dark. However, what I am doing here is coming back in with my darker graphite pencils and really helping to reinforce more of that contrast by darkening up in between some of my highlights. This therefore means you can take a little bit of pressure off yourself and that concern of not being able to get your bright highlights as bright as they need to be. The wonderful thing with graphite is it's incredibly versatile. We can come back in with our darker pencils wherever we need to. Now the Tombow mono eraser that I was using there for the highlights, I've got to be making sure that I'm using the right technique for that as well. Now I've already mentioned about the graphite has to be applied in the right way in order to make this eraser work properly, and this is something that I do cover in the real-time tutorial. If any of my real-time lessons are of interest, then I will link that all in the description below. Now I have just briefly mentioned there about the eraser highlights maybe not being as visible as they should be, which might be an indication that the layers underneath are not dark enough. Now there are times here where I will darken up the outer focus portion of the cat in the background, and by darkening that up, that's going to help make those highlights on the very edge of the paw, those real fine highlights, look more visible. Now the one thing here that I can't stress enough is it's not necessarily about the erasers that I'm using, it's more about the values. So I'm darkening up what was behind the foot in order to make the highlights look brighter. It's not about the detail. I could only add maybe half of the hairs that I've included, but as long as the values are right, that's what's going to make it look realistic. Now the contrast and values is something that I speak about in all of my real-time tutorials, because if colour was what made a piece of art look realistic, then graphite, charcoal, any grayscale medium would not look realistic at all, and that couldn't be further from the truth. Graphite is one of those mediums where you can create hyper-realistic artwork. It can look just like a black and white photograph. It's the values that make it look three-dimensional, and this is why I focused on this aspect throughout all of my lessons. As I start to work with those pencils, again I'm focusing on not just the highlights and shadows, but all of those subtle midtones. Now I think sometimes because we're so focused on those bright highlights and dark shadows that the midtones can often get forgotten about. Now it's the midtones that I feel help to build up the softness. The highlights and shadows there are helping with the contrast, but if the softness isn't there, then the texture of the fur is not going to be as realistic as it should. And here really is a great example. Look at how I'm building up a midtone, and this already looks three-dimensional. It looks like it's curving over that pad on the centre part of the foot. Now as I start to reinforce my contrast and darken the edges, and eventually I'll come back in here with that putty eraser, that's what helps to reinforce the shape even further. But if I didn't have the midtones in place, any aspect of that portrait is not going to look as three-dimensional. It's something that I really do feel makes a real difference. Now as I start to finish this foot, you can really see the changes in fur direction have been so important. That is what's helped to build up the three-dimensional shape as well as the values. But I've broken that up into two separate stages. Here on the base layer, I'm focusing on building up those highlights, midtones and shadows, and then I can start to reinforce the fur direction as I go. So even at this base layer stage, I'm looking at the way that that fur travels, but I'm blocking in those values initially. I still do want to make sure that I'm moving the pencil following the fur direction, only so that then I'm more likely to study that reference photo more accurately as I start to build in my details. But it does mean here that I am able to simplify that process. When I come in with my erasers here, I'm again following that fur direction. Now I've got a video here on YouTube. It's my top tips for drawing realistic fur in graphite. I'll link that in the description below if it's of interest. Now in that video I speak about three main things: the fur length, fur thickness and fur direction. Now the fur direction, as I've mentioned here, it does change in many different ways, but it's not random. So fur direction will follow the underlying structures under the skin. So I want to be making sure that I have replicated that in my drawing by studying the reference photo as closely as I can. Now the thickness of those pencil strokes or eraser strokes is going to depend on the technique that you're using and what that texture looks like in the reference photo. Out of focus fur is going to have a little bit more of a thicker look to it because it is more out of focus. The lines on the edges are a little bit more blurry, but if you're working with sharp in focus detail, then usually those lines are going to be far thinner. So the way that we are going to use the tools, the erasers, the pencils, whatever it may be, we're going to use the same tools, but we're going to be adjusting how we use them depending on how thick the strokes or the details need to be. Now again, this is something that I'm able to cover more thoroughly in my real-time tutorials. Because they're all recorded with a voiceover while I'm drawing, every single process is explained in the moment and very step by step. So I want to be making sure that I'm focusing as much as I can on those tinier little alterations with how I move the eraser, how I hold the pencil, how much pressure to use and so on, because those different factors can really influence what that pencil stroke or eraser stroke looks like. Now I really enjoyed working from this reference photograph because I've got both paws here that are in a very different position. So the way that the paw is on the right hand side that I'm drawing now, it's more typical of a portrait if a cat was laying down and looking at the camera. So with this direct face-on view, we've got a very different look with the toes. I want to be making sure that I am following that reference photo closely. Now again, this really doesn't look like a toe at the moment. When you start working on the first toe, I think it just is a combination of lights and darks and the shapes that we see, which is the best way of looking at it. As we start to work on more of the toes and piece in more of the puzzle together, that's when it starts to look like a foot. And one of my biggest tips at this stage is, let's say you've worked on one toe and you feel like it's not right, but you're not quite sure what it is. I would recommend to actually work on the next toe, and then you can visualize more of that foot as a larger area. I wouldn't make too many changes just with one or two toes drawn in, because quite often it might just be that it looks odd on its own. So I would just make sure to get more of that foot mapped in before you make too many drastic changes. If the whole foot is then drawn in and you then do realise that stuff needs to be adjusted, then we can go back and do that. But quite often it's more that our brain is not able to view it as the entire foot, and because toes, when they're drawn on their own, they do look a little bit strange, it's something that we feel that we might focus on too much initially. Now, one other thing to remember regarding the toes that are facing the camera like this is the fur direction is often going to be coming towards the viewer, directly at the camera. If that happens, we're going to have to significantly reduce the length of our pencil strokes. Now, the length of the pencil strokes is just as important as the direction and the thickness. If we make them too long, then the foot's going to end up too fluffy. If we make them too short, then it's not going to look like fur at all. So it's really important to get that balance right. So I really do hope that this video has been useful. If it was, I'd be very grateful if you could give it a like and a thumbs up, because it makes a huge difference to my channel. I also upload a couple of videos to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. If you've got any art related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments below. I'm more than happy to help if I can. And if you are interested in drawing along to this or any of my other real-time step-by-step tutorials, then I'll link all of the information to those lessons in the description below. I'm going to be uploading another video at the end of the week, but as always, thank you so much for watching.